I'm going to be talking about the triangulation data concept and how it relates to the artifact tracking sheet that we created and discussed with our group this week in data meeting number 2, and go over some of the highlight notes from our group meeting. So if we look at the triangulation data concept, Venables talks about reviewing additional data with the intent of making learner connections among 3 items. And if you see this diagram that I created here, it has the 3 items. First is our original source of data and the info extracted from it, additional instructional strategies, and student performance. I'm going to go through each of those and then how they relate to my artifact tracking sheet. So if we start with the first one, the original source of data, my original source of data is behavior data that I took on one of my students over the course of last year. And he showed some really high signs of aggression. And so we just kind of wanted to try and get a handle on some of those behaviors as it was really impacting his learning. So you can see over here the actual numerical times that he would aggress in a day, and then I put it into a graph so that we could see over time how he either progressed as we implemented different strategies or formulated an FBA, the functional behavior assessment, and then ultimately a BIP, the behavioral intervention plan, as well as there were some other big factors that went along, in which we discussed in data meeting number 1, and my fellow group members were able to give me a little bit of insight or questioning as to why certain trends were happening. So that was really helpful. And as we look at some of the artifacts that I brought to data meeting number 2, it will help us to be able to look at my artifact tracking sheet here in a minute. So the instructional strategies that I implemented, one of them was this here token board. This first page is an I want page, and these are items that the student could ask for at any given time without having to earn them. This was in hopes that some of these items were a necessity versus some type of reward, to help decrease a lot of the aggressive behaviors, so he could ask for those at any time. And this was a nonverbal student, so we had to have a lot of visuals, as well as the token board where he could earn up to 10 tokens for obeying his rules up at the top. And then he could earn whatever item that he was working for, whether it was a break or he liked this little fidget thing. The artifact tracking sheet that I created, I put the token board on there, and I discussed that with our group, and we agreed that this was an instructional gap, because it was something that I was working on as the educator, in trying to help shape some of those behaviors. So this could be something that was ever changing. So therefore, we listed it as an instructional gap. The other artifact that I brought was ABC data, and this is where you take really in-depth data, even more so than the behavior data you saw in my first graph, where it literally could be minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day, and you can see the dates and times over here. And what it does is it just breaks it down so that we can really assess where the student is at that given moment when the behavior occurs. So as I looked through each of these more in depth, I was able to record some of them on the artifact tracking sheet, in which my group and I discussed, and tried to figure out if it was an instructional gap or if it was a learning gap. So if we go back to my artifact tracking sheet, we were able to see that on certain pages there were instructional gaps and there were learning gaps. So I talked about how transitions seemed to be more of an instructional gap and something that we as the staff could help him during those times, whereas responding to demands was more of a learning gap because he needs to learn how to cope and and respond to the different demands that we're given. You can't just get out of, working or doing your assignment just because you're having a behavior. The last thing I wanted to highlight was our notes. Our recorder for the night was Jim, and he recorded some great notes on some things that we talked about, and I just wanted to highlight a few of those. One of our group members, Jennifer, has given us some park data that we went over. So for her artifact tracking sheet, I was able to comment on some of the artifacts that she brought seemed like great resources in order to continue to implement with her students as she tries to kind of replicate what the students see on park versus just teaching them the concept, kind of teaching them the formatting as well, so that they're seeing it in the same light in either sense when she's teaching it and then when they're taking the test. Also, my group members noted that some of these demands are how the student needs to learn and how these are necessary to life skills. They might be things that the student needs to learn how to work through internally versus an instructional strategy. And then Jim was able to kind of share some of his data. He works with ESOL students, and so he had some SLO data as well as some park data, and talked about how some of the students that are struggling are the ones that he works with on a regular basis in kind of a pull-out model, and we were just encouraging him on some of the artifacts that he was labeling instructional gaps to maybe reassess kind of that pull-out session and note whether or not they might be learning gaps in that pull-out session versus an instructional gap. Maybe look at each student individually when he pulls them out into a smaller group. And so that's kind of a highlight over the triangulation data concept, as well as the artifact tracking sheet that we created this week. I really enjoyed this assignment as my group members were able to comment a lot on mine, as well as I was able to comment a lot on theirs and see some things and comment on some things that we might have not seen if we hadn't done this as a group. So thanks so much.